Welcome to the Do No Harm podcast, where we discuss the battle to keep politics out of medicine. With our hosts, Dr. Marilyn Singleton and Do No Harm's founder, Dr. Stanley Goldfarb. Together, we're talking with people to create a better healthcare system for all, one that's based on medicine, not division.
Anti-Semitism has been on the rise before the terrorist attacked Israeli civilians on October 7th, with woke groups on university campuses seeking to ban Jewish speakers and those who support Israel. Just awful. And since the October terrorist attacks, the blatant anti-Semitism is raging across college campuses. And worse, it's spiked. They're demonizing one group in an effort to prop up another. The dangerous path of modern-day wokeism fosters this group bias rather than focusing on an individual's care, and can and will affect all of us regardless of our gender, our race, our religious affiliation, or creed. In 1946, German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller wrote, "Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." This woke ideology, it's been baked into the foundation of universities for the past decade and probably more. It's shut down discussion on anything that they have decided is sensitive, and it's created a breeding ground for anti-Semitism. We have a wonderful guest today who's going to talk about this phenomenon, David Bernstein.
David
Great
Bernstein.
To be with you.
Thank you, David. David Bernstein founded the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. The Institute supports viewpoint diversity, counters woke ideology in the Jewish community. He served as president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs as the national umbrella for local Jewish advocacy. He recently wrote a book, Woke Antisemitism, exploring how progressive ideology harms Jews. David, welcome to our podcast. I've just read an article that you wrote, I think it just came out in the last few days, where you explored the origins of campus anti-Semitism. And I think it would be really useful for our listeners if you would just recount the ways you think that this terrible problem has originated.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, it really goes back more than 5 decades when postmodernism burst onto the scene and became a dominant ideology of campus. You can actually trace it back to the almost exact moment when San Francisco State University platformed its first ethnic studies program after months of student protests. And those studies programs rapidly spread to about 1,300 campuses within a few years. And they held that they were a major departure from the way that the scholars looked at the world, the modernist approach, which is that ideas can be debated and discussed and that scientific inquiry can advance civilization. That was the rationalist, Enlightenment, modern approach. But what they were arguing is that knowledge, such as it is, comes from the powerful forces in society who then embed what we all think of as knowledge into social discourses, the way we talk about things, that in order to keep themselves in power. So that's sort of the basic postmodern view of the world, that there's no such thing as real truth or real knowledge. It's all about power. Now, that sort of was the dominant way that many in the humanities saw the world for a while, but it actually took a turn to the more extreme. It was sort of, it morphed into what you might call post-colonialism or post-colonial studies with Edward Said, the Palestinian American literary critic, who tried to then discredit the way that the Western world looked at the Middle East or the Near East, and said that it was all about trying to dominate it. It was an act of imperialism. Our study of the Middle East was an act of imperialism. And that became, ironically, a dominant discourse itself. And it crowded out a lot of other ways of looking at the world, that crowded out the Western way of understanding the world. At the same time that was all happening in the late 1960s, the Soviet Union invented a new field called Zionology, which was a way of discrediting Zionism, which was a national liberation movement of the Jewish people. It was concerned that Soviet Jews were starting to get behind the Zionist idea after Israel won this resounding war in 1967. And so it put anti-Zionism front and center of progressive politics. And just a few years later, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution, Zionism is racism. So that, again, it took the post-colonial idea and dedicated it to the anti-Zionist proposition. And a third factor here is really the role of Middle Eastern money. It used to be Saudi Arabian money, but these days it's Qatari money. Billions of dollars of Qatari money has flowed into the American academia in the past few years. $5 billion, according to some estimates. There's much more of it. So I think that's obviously a grand sweep of what's happened, and you could get into greater detail with it all, but I think that's why we're at where we're at. It all began in the classroom. Hearing
this, I think a lot of people haven't even thought about the origins and say, well, I don't hate Jews. There really isn't any anti-Semitism. I don't know. It's one of those things that, as you talk about, it's been happening for years and it sort of boils up. Tell me what made you start the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Was what was happening in the Jewish world that you were involved in that made you kind of think twice about what are liberal values? What does that really mean?
Yeah, so that campus ideology that I talked about that began with postmodernism and postcolonialism morphed into something what we might call wokeism or critical social justice or radical social justice ideology that holds that there are two types of people in the world. There are oppressed and oppressors, and that any group that on average succeeds, like Jews, is usually lumped in with the oppressor class. And so it's very hard for people to see Jews as victims of anything if your formula is racism equals prejudice plus power. That's the formula that I heard way back in the late 1990s for the first time. And I was stunned because all of a sudden I'm like, okay, if Jews are viewed as a powerful group, then we really can't be victims of racism. And if groups that are considered to be oppressed have no power, then they can't really be racist. So where does that leave us? And I followed that carefully, and I was very worried about that discourse catching on in center-left and left-wing circles. And it's exactly what happened. I mean, by the time I started my last position as CEO of a umbrella Jewish organization in 2016, this view was just gaining traction in both Jewish circles and obviously in progressive circles. And so I understood that we had to take a different tack. And I eventually left after 5 years and started this new organization. You know, I've always been a believer that people need to be able to talk to each other to solve problems, that's how civilization functioned. Its operating system was what you might call liberalism, the free expression of ideas, individual rights, and the like. And that was being challenged in a fundamental way by this ideology. And it was also giving rise to a new variant of anti-Semitism. So I knew we needed to name this and we needed to start fighting back, even if there were a lot of people who didn't like what I was saying.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things you mentioned as a true liberal value is free speech. And that's one of the biggest things we've seen, not only on college campuses, but in medical schools. How do they quell free speech? Is it not having the speakers even come on campus, or what's going on there?
Yeah, and I've noted how prevalent it's become in medical schools. I watched the graduation of, I think it was University of Minnesota's medical school class when they read from this script that started with a land acknowledgement and talked about the complicity of medicine and oppression and the like. And you really get a sense of how young doctors are being indoctrinated, or maybe in some cases are attracted to the field because they think it reflects those radical social justice values that they've been inculcated in. And, what happens is that very often is a relatively small group of people who are loud push their agenda hard and make it very hard for mainstream people or even, administrators who might not share those values to resist. Because no one wants to be called a racist. No one wants to be called a hater. No one wants to deny indigenous rights and the indigenous narrative. So they just go along with these things, even if they're not true believers. And that's how institutional capture happens. That's why you wake up one morning and the medical school graduating class is reading from some script about their views on the world and really the opinion of a few people. That's why it's happening in the legal profession as well. That's what you're seeing in many, many different quarters of society. These are people who can dominate small institutions, echo chambers. Once you expand the scope of the referendum, once you show that there are minority views within the larger body politic, you can start to expose them and you can start to push them back a bit. But they really thrive in these small institutional settings where they can dominate.
David, you wrote an article several years ago about Jewish students, and you talked about them losing arguments but winning friends.
I did.
Now,
yes.
Yesterday in Philadelphia, for example, there was a blockage of traffic that was mostly led by Jews, mostly led by rabbis that were, arguing for a ceasefire now in Gaza. Could you talk a little bit about how you think that these issues have developed within the Jewish community and what the conflicts there are?
Yeah, so way back when I wrote that piece, I'm guessing it must have been 2012 or 2013, something like that. I still believe that we could win over the discourse on campus by engaging people. There was a different ideology in place on campus at that time. I mean, not that you didn't see this more radical version of woke, but what you saw back then were people who just didn't believe anybody had the truth. And as long as you offered your own story and your own narrative, you could win over people. That you couldn't discount anybody else's narrative in those days. In 2013, 2014, that started to shift with the Ferguson protests and the killing of Michael Brown and the onset of sort of the Black Lives Matter movement. The campus ideology started to change. Jonathan Haidt, Greg Lukianoff wrote about this in The Coddling of the American Mind, that they noticed the shift. And as the head of a campus organization, a pro-Israel campus organization at that time, I noticed the shift. So I wouldn't argue what I argued way back then. I do think that when we see a group of radical young Jews protesting, we have to understand that is a relatively small percentage of people, a very loud group. And it's easy to think that somehow young Jews have all or mostly gone in that direction. There are other people who have noted that as well. I have a 26-year-old son who lives in Brooklyn, hangs around a cool crowd. And none of his extended friends group have bought into this ideology in that way. So I do think it's grown in influence and it's grown in numbers, but I still think it's a pretty small minority of even young Jews.
Well, that's refreshing to hear. My son teaches college, and sometimes I lament what's happening to the young folks. And he said, really, you can't look at the media. You can't believe everything you hear, because he says most of his students are reasonable people and have very adult ideas. And one thing, when you talk about this small handful of very loud people, what can we do about it? Because that always seems to be the way, that there's some very mouthy people out there and they can take over the narrative. What is it that we can do to let people know another side of the story?
Yeah. So I mentioned this idea of expanding the scope of the referendum. Let me give you an example of that. Right after October 7th, a group of very radical Columbia professors came out with one of those open letters signed by about 100 other professors. And if that was the last word on the matter, you might think that those 100 professors represented Columbia University, where there has been a lot of radicalism. But another professor wrote an alternative letter that was quite sympathetic with Israel and discounted the other letter, and that was signed by something like 500 professors. Mostly, by the way, science professors, but still, it showed you that it's easy to inflate the influence of the 100 professors if you didn't expand the scope of the referendum and expose that to be the minority voice. So I think that in some ways, that's our task. Look, here's the thing. Moderate people, whether they're center right or center left, tend not to want to engage with radicals because, there's that old saying, never wrestle with a pig because you'll get dirty and besides the pig likes it. And so moderates tend not to want to engage with the pig, right? We don't want to get dirty. And so we stay out of the argument. And when we do that over time, what we do is we cede the field to the pig, to the extremist voice. And I think our task is to get the silent majority of moderates to start to push back, to realize that they have a stake in this, that they have to get a little dirty. And so groups like, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and Do No Harm, I think our job is to find those people and to convince them to start to speak out and to organize better than they have. You see this in places like Northern California and Southern California, where the curriculum has gone so nuts in these places for K through 12 education that you see moderate Jewish moms really starting to, connect with each other on WhatsApp groups and the like and start to fight back. I think that's got to be the movement that we build over time here in this country, and that can eventually, I hope, push it back.
David, Yascha Mounk, the political scientist from Johns Hopkins, has written a book called The Identity Trap, which echoes lots of the ideas that you've laid out as well. He foresees this conflict going on for a very long time without real resolution. What's your long-term view of how this is all going to play out? I know it's always hard to make predictions, particularly about the future, but let's see if you can take a crack at it.
Yeah. Well, I'm reading The Identity Trap. I think I'm on chapter 6 now, so I'm a good way through. It's an excellent book, and he really does trace back the influence of these ideas and how they made an impact. I do think that we can start turning the tide. It doesn't mean that you're not going to make it go away, but I think that there are ways that you can start to push back and marginalize these ideas. At University of North Carolina and at Yale Law School, there are new programs of open inquiry that are meant to attract students who want to be in an intellectually diverse environment. Now, one might ask, well, shouldn't that be the entire university? And the answer would be yes, but it's not. And I think we're going to create those institutions so that they can compete against these studies departments and universities. Again, that's a long-term generational structural solution, but I do think that can have an impact over time. And so I think that's exactly the kind of thing we need to be doing to change things. So I agree with him that, one shouldn't be overly optimistic that you can immediately wave a wand and make it all go away, or that you've reached some magical point of peak woke and from there it just declines. A lot of this is deeply entrenched, deeply institutionalized, and it's going to take a while, but I do think it can be done.
Well, colleges have traditionally been the source of free speech. I mean, this seems to be the basis of granting tenure, that you couldn't fire somebody because they spoke out. And now it seems like it's just the opposite. And it gives me these visuals of people in Tiananmen Square saluting to a giant picture of Mao and saying whatever the folks want them to say just so they can get their crumbs of bread or rice. And it gives me the chills when I do hear people at graduation and read some of these things that they're having the kids recite, and they're just thinking, well, I just want to get my degree. I'll just say it. But
yes.
This to me seems, how they say this is how it begins, that turning us into drones, and it's people like you who speak up. That's why Do No Harm speaks up, trying to get us to speak our own minds. What other ideas do you have for helping people just find it within themselves to speak up? You say the parents, it kind of hit them in the gut when they saw what was happening to their kids. What can other folks do?
Yeah. So at some point when I started doing this and I founded the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, I realized that I was in a different business than I thought I was. I wasn't in the business of just pushing liberal values. We did that. I wasn't in the business of just exposing left-wing anti-Semitism, we did that too. I was in the courage business. And my job was to figure out how to make people more courageous. And so I started doing things a little differently. I started calling the question with certain people. I knew there were people who agreed with me, and they, and I would do something I like to call the awkward dance. You start talking about these issues. You don't go right for the jugular. You start to say, well, what do you think about the state of free discourse? And before you know it, you find out that they're kindred spirits on these issues. Once you have that, you start to push them a little bit. There was a woman who was the director of a Jewish institution who I discovered really agreed with me about this, and she had really done her homework and knew a lot about it, but she hadn't said anything publicly. So at first time I said, well, would you have me speak to your organization? And she said, I'll think about it. And then she said, yes. And then I said, okay, would you be willing to post about it on Facebook? Would you be willing to write about it in the listserv of your sort of the professional listserv? Thought about it. She said yes. So eventually she sort of outed herself in the process. And I think now is someone who's, been vocal about it. We need more of that. We have to find people and we have to ask them to do things, because the inertia of not doing something because it feels really risky is always going to be there. There was a teacher who I met from the public schools who had all kinds of materials that really exposed how extreme the curriculum had gotten in my area in Montgomery County Public Schools. And I sat with him over coffee and I said, well, what's holding you back? And he had this idea that Antifa was going to come to his home and start protesting, and right in front of his home. And I said, you know what? I've been doing this for 2.5 years. I wrote a book about it, and there's never been an Antifa person that showed up. So, I saw there was a sigh of relief, and eventually he came forward. So I think we've got to do that at scale. We've got to just really start asking people to speak out, finding who they are, asking them to speak out, and organizing them. And building new coalitions, by the way, of people. Like there are Chinese American groups that, left China, left what you described as the Cultural Revolution. Those are people who don't want the country they fled to sound like the country they fled from. So let's get to know them. Let's build up a new coalition that stands up for these values, these liberal values that we all believe in.
David, let me ask you a question about the approach that some of the donors have taken vis-a-vis the Ivy League institutions that have now been revealed to be such hotbeds of anti-Semitism. So one of the arguments is that what needs to happen is to extend diversity, equity, and inclusion to include Jewish students, unlike the way Jewish students perceive it now, as opposed to the other argument that people like Cliff Asness have made, that what we really need is just a complete elimination of all these speech codes and ability to speak out. What would you say about that dynamic between extending diversity, equity, and inclusion to Jewish students compared to getting rid of all of these speech codes?
Yeah, or just opposing outright these DEI programs, trying to get them ultimately banned. I'm in the camp of DEI is problematic, and trying to bring in the Jewish narrative or get them to cover anti-Semitism is a mistake on the part of the Jewish community. I understand why we would do it if it's the quote unquote the only game in town, and I get the impulse, but I think it ultimately means that we're just reinforcing the ideological framework that keeps on giving, that it becomes like a game of whack-a-mole, because the ideological framework is what's creating the anti-Semitism in the first place. Now, there are people in the Jewish community who have argued, well, okay, you oppose it and we'll engage it. And isn't that the best, like a good cop, bad cop approach? And I say that's a cop out, because what happens is that we end up with Jewish organizations clustering around engaging DEI. And so everybody wants to be the good guy. That's the problem. Everybody wants to be the good guy, and we're fighting anti-Semitism by being the good guy. And so then the bad guy is like, two people like me who are pushing back against it, and not the full force of the Jewish community. So I think that I want to see the center of gravity of that change. I think we need to oppose DEI, or as Eboo Patel argued when it was in a column that David Brooks wrote, transform it so that it's not illiberal. I don't know which of those two things is easier, banning it, and we saw that, I think, at Oklahoma University this last week, and you're going to see more of that in red states, or trying to transform it. But, maybe both of those things at the same time. But I'd like to see a lot less engaging of it and a lot less trying to get Jews covered in the Oppression Olympics.
Well, that's great advice, and I think we certainly at Do No Harm totally agree with you. We feel like elimination of these diversity, equity, and inclusion regimens is absolutely vital if we're going to turn this around and have institutions where speech and enlightenment values are now free and freely discussed. So thank you so much for your words of wisdom to us today, and thank you so much for what you're doing and through your wonderful activities in the Jewish community.
Well, I appreciate what you do as well, and it's good to know that there are people fighting this in really important professions, especially medicine, where I think it really has taken effect, and we've got to be able to do all of this together. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Well, before we let you go, can you tell us how to find you and how to find your book, Woke Antisemitism?
Yes, Woke Antisemitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews is on Amazon. It is now also an audio book, so you can listen to it as well by somebody who has a much better voice than I do for talking. I'm on Twitter at David L. Bernstein. And our website is JILV.org, and we have all kinds of good information on that. So, and our Twitter is at JILV.org. So I hope you'll stay connected.
Well, thank you very much. And believe me, we need more rational voices like you out there in the public square. And I'd just like to thank everyone for listening, and thank you for supporting Do No Harm's efforts to protect patients and physicians and healthcare itself from divisive ideology. And just, again, to everyone, you can always find us at donoharmmedicine.org. Thanks again for listening.